My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Dr. Monica De La Torre is an assistant professor of media and expressive culture in the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University. Valerie Grues, the doctoral student at Northwestern University and an affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Monica in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that the Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Valerie will tell us more about Monica's research and career in just a minute. Then Monica will present her work, and after that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen at any point in time. Valerie will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Valerie, the screen is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pablo, thank you so much for having me as a moderator for this incredible seminar. It is an absolute honor for me to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Monica De La Torre holds a BA in Psychology and Chicana and Chicano Studies from the University of California, Davis, an MA in Chicana and Chicano Studies from California State University, Northridge, and a PhD in Feminist Studies from the University of Washington. Professor De La Torre is currently an assistant professor of media and expressive culture in the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University. Her work focuses on interdisciplinary research and teaching practices that bridge Chicana feminist theory, Latinx feminist media studies, radio and sound studies, and women's and gender studies. As a critical scholar and practitioner of digital media and radio, she analyzes both media content and production practices to push the analytic edge of scholarship for grounding modalities of difference such as gender, race, class, and citizenship. Dr. De La Torre is the author of a book and an extensive selection of journal articles, book chapters, and online publications. Her most recent work includes Feminista Frequencies, Community Building Through Radio in the Yakima Valley, Amazing Grace, Keeps the Platter Spinning, a photo essay on radio and television trailblazer Graciela Gil Olivares, and Feminista Frequencies, Chicana Radio Activism in the Pacific Northwest, amongst many others. Dr. De La Torre has received numerous fellowships and grants, making a strong contribution to the field and receiving numerous awards for her research. Over the years, she has been an active member in the field through her scholarly experiences, as well as collaborative and community-based research projects. We are so honored to have Dr. De La Torre today to share with us her knowledge and experience, so thank you so much. And as a reminder to our audience, please submit your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, which is located at the bottom of your screen at any point during the seminar. We will address these questions in the Q&A portion after the presentation. And with that, Dr. De La Torre, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here and for the very warm welcome. It is an honor to be the speaker for this seminar series. And again, I'd like to thank everyone at the Center for Latinx Digital Media for the invitation and for coordinating this event. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to begin the presentation. I was checking my slides earlier and it started from where I was checking. So let me just backtrack a bit. But again, I'm really excited to be here and to share with you some of the research from the book Feminista Frequencies, Community Building Through Radio in the Yakima Valley. It is a book that I authored after my dissertation work was completed. I took the research I did for my dissertation and turned it into this monograph that we have today. So I'll be sharing with you a small portion of the book, focusing on the radio programming, but really centering the women of Radio Cadena. So first of all, again, I'd like to say thank you for the invitation and for everyone involved in funding the program and sponsoring all of the speakers in this wonderful virtual seminar series. It's so wonderful to be able to share my work with you all today. So thank you again for being here. To give you a brief overview of the talk today, I will go ahead and give you a background and historical context. Community radio is an area, a field of study that really doesn't deserve or doesn't get the deserved attention that it really needs. It is a field that is growing, especially when we think about Spanish language community radio. And it's a field that is really exciting because there's just so much work to be done to really uncover the deep history and participation of Chicana and Chicano communities in public broadcasting. So I will be giving you an overview of Radio Cadena KDNA 91.9 FM, which started in Granger, Washington in the 1970s. I'll give you a brief overview of the programming. Again, I'll go into depth into the Chicana radio broadcasters. I'll end with a sneak peek into the archive, the online archive I've been working on for the past several years, and then we'll open it up to questions. Now, community radio has a really deep history, especially when it comes to the production aspect that was unchained from really commercial-based production practice in radio during the 1960s and 70s. So we had the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 that really opened up the doors for many marginalized groups to enter the public airwaves, both on television and on radio. However, although some groups were organized to create public broadcasting on television, the high cost and high learning curve for television meant that radio became a much more welcomed technology to use. So community activists that were involved in the Chicano movement at the time noticed that, again, radio was such a rich cultural tradition for Mexican American, Chicana and Chicano communities across the United States and across the border, right? Many of us grow up with radio, listening to the radio with our families, in the car, on our way to work, to school. I personally listen to the radio with my mom all the time. So it's very much a cultural touchstone for Mexican American communities. As early as the 1920s, when radio was starting to get off the ground, radio brokers would buy airtime to air Spanish language content. So radio has always been a tool, a technological tool that Spanish-speaking communities have used and have innovated. But the map you see here right now is a sampling of some of the community-based radio stations that were formed after the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. So KDNA in Granger, Washington was one of many radio stations that started at the time. The first radio station, bilingual radio station, was KBBF in Santa Rosa, California. On the heels of that was KDNA in Granger, Washington. Radio Bilingüe in Fresno, California was another station that started in 1980. In 1985 in Alamosa, Colorado, we have KRZA, K Raza, that was started by 5 farm worker women. Now, what you've noticed maybe a pattern in all these radio stations is that they're found in mostly rural communities, right? Where we have farm worker communities, migrant communities that have traveled, through the US, through the migrant trail for work. And again, need a form of communication, a point of access, a point of cultural building and entertainment. And that's what these radio stations are providing. Now, Radio Cadena was unique in that it was the first full-time Spanish language radio station in the US. And what that did for the community in the Yakima Valley is incredible. It became a lifeline. It became a gathering place. The radio station, as I'll show you in a bit, became a gathering place for communities. It was, the place that people would call instead of calling the police or the fire department. They would call Radio Cadena with any question or any emergency. And what is incredible is that just 5 months after the station went on air, Mount St. Helens erupted in the Pacific Northwest. So as soon as authorities announced the impending threat of volcanic ash from the eruption of Mount St. Helens on the morning of May 18th, 1980, KDNA FM began broadcasting news of the fiery eruption that killed 57 people and destroyed 250 homes. A mere 5 months before the eruption, on December 19th, 1979, KDNA's community radio broadcasters had transformed the 91.9 FM dial into one of the first full-time Spanish language community radio stations in the US, shifting the airwaves of the Yakima Valley's agricultural hub into a space where approximately 35,000 Spanish-speaking residents, especially farm workers, could tune in for the latest emergency responses, news, music, and community-based programming. Cadena's announcement about the eruption allowed farm workers who were out in the fields at 8:39 a.m. when the explosion occurred to seek safety from the harmful effects of the ash. Located in Granger, Washington, approximately 85 miles east of Mount St. Helens, KDNA was the only full-time Spanish language media outlet in the region capable of reporting this catastrophic emergency to the region's Spanish-speaking farm worker community, which by the early 1980s consisted of both men and women in the fields. Station manager Rosa Ramon and staff acted quickly to start emergency broadcast services, transmitting the news that, quote, Santa Elena ha eruptado. Vayan a sus casas y sigan escuchando Radio Cadena. St. Helens has erupted. Go to your homes and stay tuned to KDNA for more information. While the transmission of on December 19th was technically Cadena's first broadcast on its newly licensed designation on the radio dial at 91.9 FM, just a few years earlier, a group of Chicana and Chicano community activists, along with 2 radio producers hailing from Michigan, had begun radio production workshops with farm worker youth. This project created early iterations of Spanish programs that would later become KDNA's signature broadcasting mix of news, music, cultural affairs programming. Radio Cadena, the name given to the project before the designated call letters of KDNA were established in 1979, first started in Linden, Washington. In 1975, where radio producers Julio Cesar Guerrero and Dan Robleski, or Dan Roble, educated farm worker youth in radio production skills. Now, what I came to this project, having had experience with radio production myself, community radio production. I was a member of the radio collective called Soul Rebel Radio out of KPFK FM in Los Angeles from about 2007 to 2010 before starting my doctoral studies at the University of Washington. I was completing my master's in Chicana and Chicano studies at the time and was interested in Chicana feminist studies and cultural production. I wrote my master's thesis on theater, el teatro de las Chicanas, and Chicana feminist expression and the development of identity through theater. When I started my graduate program at the University of Washington in gender, women, and sexuality studies, I had no idea that radio would be the driving force behind my research. But when I met with my faculty dissertation advisor, the great Michelle Habel-Payan, I learned about this radio station, KDNA, she shared with me that was a radio station started by Chicanas and Chicanos in the 1970s. And as a Chicana Studies master's student, I was blown away that I had never heard about this station, that in all of my studies of the Chicano movement, Chicana feminist movements, I had never heard of ways in which Chicanas were on the radio at the time. I thought that, for a long time, I didn't recognize that I was part of a larger lineage of Chicana radio broadcasters. So you see here, Rosa Ramon, who has become a really integral and important part of this research process. She was the first station manager at KDNA. She is the reason that a lot of the archive that we have created together now exists. She documented the early days of the station with a camera she purchased from her first paycheck after she started working. And she really became instrumental in bringing women on board during the early days of Radio Cadena, really giving the station its feminist edge that I argue about in the book. And so as you see here in these images, again, my interaction with this work has been one that has been really personal, but also has instructed me on how to do this work in a feminist way and to do this work from a community-based perspective. Now, part of my methods include oral histories. I have met many of the founders and early broadcasters of KDNA and other Chicano-based community stations. I then have created an online archive using digital humanities tools and the framework of digital humanities as a democratizing imperative, right? To use technology to help our communities to expand our awareness of these hidden histories that often are not archived in official government sanctioned archives or can't be easily accessed through Google searches. These are archives that must be created collectively, but also that have been my own creation has been from a Chicana feminist archivista perspective that I learned and really practiced from my work with Dr. Michelle Hebo-Payan at the University of Washington with a project called Women Who Rock. This is a praxis that takes on, the knowledge that we've been written out of history, that women, Chicanas, have not been seen as central or important to a lot of these media histories, especially radio and radio broadcasting. So this method and methodology is really grounded in a Chicana feminist praxis. Here I am here with one of the producers, Bernice Zuniga, during our first meeting and interview back in 2019. So again, having these moments of being able to create this oral history with these women in particular has been very transformative for my own research and development. Now, to get back to KDNA, so as I said, I've been working with Rosa Ramon, who was the only woman co-founder of the station, but she was at the time working with an organization called Northwest Rural Opportunities. And this was an organization that was helping farm workers and their families access resources, social services, childcare, bilingual programs, migrant education programs. And Rosa was in charge of one of those programs, along with the director, Ricardo Garcia, who you see pictured here. Now, Julio Cesar Guerrero and Dan Roble were the producers coming from Michigan who had been training farm worker youth in radio production. They began creating radio programs with the help of a community station in Seattle called KRAB, K-R-A-B FM. And this was at the time one of the first community radio stations in Seattle. And now KDNA at the time wasn't able to be on the regular FM dial. They had to be on a subsidiary signal called an SCA signal, which you needed a special receiver to listen to this. NRO bought about 150 receivers, distributed them throughout Seattle, throughout different community centers, and started broadcasting Radio Cadena programming. However, the cost of these special receivers and with the encouragement of KRAB station manager Chuck Granger, Rosa, along with Ricardo, Julio, and Dan, decided to go ahead and just apply for their own signal, for their own FM signal. And that's what they did starting in 1976, creating this Radio Cadena project. But at the time, again, they're training farm worker youth. They are building up their radio production skills to then transfer that over to Granger, Washington, in Eastern Washington. Now, the founders of Radio Cadena, along with the volunteers, started the station and built it from the ground up. They built everything, including the radio transmission shack. They had to dig into hard rock at Tanham Ridge, where they built the signal, the antenna, and the radio transmitter shack. So here we have a picture of Rosa along with Dan and two unidentified engineers inside of the transmitter shack, getting the radio transmitter ready for the first live broadcast on December 19th, 1979. Here are some of the founders and volunteers on top of a Tanham Ridge. Again, this is one of my favorite pictures of the many pictures that we've been able to collect and scan and digitize. But I really love this picture because you see lots of different things at play. You have the folks, both men and women, volunteering, being, taking care of one another on this pickup truck. You see the food, you see the drinks. So they went up to work, but they're also, building community. What better to build community than food, right? That brings us together many times. And so they're on the Tanham Ridge, which is part of the Yakima Nation. So they had to work with and negotiate with the Yakima tribe to gain access to this part of the ridge. And so again, showing some collaboration between indigenous groups, but also Chicana and Chicano activists. And also you see the fields in the background, you see the farm workers. You can't see the farm workers, but you know that the fields in the background signal that this is an area of agriculture that most likely has Mexican-American farm workers working there. And you see how proud the founders are. They're pointing up at the transmission tower and saying, we did this work. We're building the station for our community to benefit Spanish-speaking listeners that are often ignored by commercial and other media. Now, the radio station itself, the building, once they moved to Granger, was housed in a building known as the Academy. It was a building that had a life of its own. It used to be, it was originally a hotel called the Highline Hotel in the early 1900s. It was the midway point in Washington between Spokane and Seattle on the rail route. And so this was the halfway point where people would stop and rest and stay at this hotel. It later became known as the Academy. It was a Seventh-day Adventist church. And then after that, it was transferred over to a group of Chicano organizations that ended up leasing part of the building to Radio Cadena for $1 a year to house the radio station, the studio. So you see KDNA radio here on the left. This building actually no longer exists, but the radio station is still at the same location in a new building that is now called the Northwest Communities Education Center in Granger, Washington, in the same location. And this was built in the 2000s by Ricardo Garcia and the Radio Cadena staff through various grants. They created this beautiful new center for the community where people can go and rent out rooms, and there's a lot of community services organizations that own office space or rent office space in the building. You see the logo, the KDNA farm worker logo at the front of the building, right? Really signaling again to the community that this is the radio station, but also a community hub. In the early days of the station, they would have events, tardeadas, or Sunday gatherings for families, health fairs, education fairs. So the station itself really became central to community building in the region. some of the radio programs that Radio Cadena produced, showing again their creativity and their bringing in the cultural aspects, right? Using like radio novelas, which Mexican American communities listen to. We'll hear some of the radio program right now.
First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to the studios of Radio Cadena, located in Granger, Washington. Radio Cadena broadcasts 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, programming a station with educational, informational, and cultural programs every day for 18 hours requires a great deal of work, effort, and dedication. Come in and meet part of the crew that makes it all possible.
So for a long time, I couldn't find recordings. Recordings of old radio programs, especially those produced in the 70s and 80s, are hard to come by. Oftentimes, reels, the magnetic tape that was used to record the programs, were reused. They were not, saved or stored. And those that are saved or stored, oftentimes are not being held in the most appropriate conditions, right? And so to transfer magnetic tape to digital platforms takes a lot of work and special, tools and special technologies, right, to transfer these tapes. So when I was able to get this recording that Rosa found, this was a recording that highlighted the women of Radio Cadena at the station. And I'll play you another clip in a bit. But what I really admire about this segment is that, it's inviting us into the station. It's telling us what a resource the radio station is for the community, with programming like El Jardín de los Niños, which is a children-based program where they invited children to, play, to call in and ask for a song, and there was play and laughter and characters that the children identified with and recognized. They had a women's program called Mujer, which centered the needs and concerns of women, which is, for the time, having Chicanas at the center of radio production was very, very innovative. During the morning times, they had musical programming, Amanecer Ranchero, to get, farm workers up, and moving in the mornings, especially when they had to get up early and, go to the fields and work. They also had health programming. One of the really innovative shows, Tres Hombres Sin Fronteras, or Three Men Without Borders, was a really important radio drama that was produced by KDNA, and that you see some images here of the recording of this radio drama that was about HIV/AIDS prevention amongst farm workers, a controversial topic because they covered HIV/AIDS, sexually transmitted diseases, condom use, and at the time, for communities to hear this on the radio was very controversial. But again, they knew that this was important for the community to know about and listen to in an entertaining and accessible way. Now, before they could, you could go to Google to see what radio show is played where or download a podcast. They had to create these radio program guides to let community know what radio shows are playing at what time. This was also a way of fundraising for the radio station. They would have a card in the back where listeners could sending money to support the radio station. So these radio program guides showcase not just the radio programs, but also the cultural aspect that I call in the book this rascuache aesthetics to their production, where we have this hand-drawn covers. The cover from my book actually comes from this program guide that you have on the right, that showcases the migrant family traveling to Granger from Texas. You see the Texas license plates showcased on the car, and Radio Cadena acting as the sun, illuminating the way for this family, welcoming them to the Pacific Northwest, to Eastern Washington, and letting them know that Radio Cadena is there to help this migrant family. The program guides are Ondas en Español de Primavera, Springtime Spanish Airwaves, This one is a sample from March 1980, and this is exemplary of KDNA's mission to reach farm workers, especially migrant families. The program guide provided air information of when the radio shows, what time they would air. So here again, we have evidence of the types of shows we would listen to Radio Cadena in 1980, again, providing us with the evidence when audio artifacts are not available. So again, we have shows that they would transmit from other community stations like PBS in San Diego. They would transmit a show from NPR called Enfoque Nacional, which was NPR's only Spanish language radio program that broadcast from 1979 to 1988 approximately. They had a variety of musical shows. They had English shows as well, a blues and jazz show. They would have religious programming on Sundays. They would have a priest come in and talk, have their own radio program. So again, really trying to have a holistic understanding of what the family and the community wanted to listen to. Here's some images of the El Viejito, the El Jardín de los Niños. It was the children's radio program I mentioned. You see the characters in costume, which is to me really, hilarious, but also very endearing to see, the characters in costume really taking their job of providing entertainment to children seriously. But also what I realized in these images is that they also would go out into the community dressed up as the characters and go again to the fairs or appear at the tardeadas at the radio station. And so really, again, integrating into the community. Here are some more of the volunteers at the radio station. We have Roberto Alviso and another volunteer with a Granger shirt at the turntables, maybe playing some music, taking us into the next segment or the next radio program. Again, these images just are really, for me as a media producer, really inspiring to see members of our community, people that look like, you could be like my tias or tios or cousins, behind the microphone, in front of the mic during this time period that, for a long time we think, we weren't influential, we weren't even around in radio studios. We actually see that we were. Here's some more pictures of the staff at the first on-air fund drive. So as I mentioned, community radio oftentimes is funded through grants, through government grants, grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but oftentimes they were also funded through listener support. So we have here some of the staff, including a lot of the women, the early women radio producers, Celia Prieto, Bernice Zuniga, Rosa Ramon, Maria Estela Rebollosa, and Estella Del Villar, helping with the on-air fund drive. Now, part of my research was really centering women and centering Chicana radio producers and their development of what I've come to term Chicana radio praxis. And now I uncovered and really started to think about how this radio praxis was enacted by these women. And I found that there were 4 main areas, right? These aren't the only 4 areas, but I focused on these 4 areas because I found that these were the ways in which women were really able to create feminist programming and a feminist environment in a really male-dominated space that is media production, especially public broadcasting. So the leadership, as I said, Rosa being the station manager, really had a lot to do with including women from the beginning, the programming, centering women, centering not just women's topics, but women as producers of that programming by hiring and training them in radio production, and then also developing anti-sexist policies and practices at the station. Now, Rosa was really instrumental in bringing women on board as, the station manager. What she really drove home for me in our interviews and interactions was how much she knew the importance of covering all aspects of a woman's life, of Latinas, of farm worker women, and that it really was the first time, or one of the first times, that anyone had heard programming like that, where they talked about sensitive topics like incest and rape. This program that I learned about, where they brought on an expert, a sexual assault and incest expert, that program, people kept calling weeks after the segment aired, wanting to know more, to have access to the resources shared. And again, radio gives that anonymity in a lot of ways. It gives that privacy for people that are wanting to discuss sensitive topics. You know, you could call in and be anonymous for the most part. And this was one of the, really important aspects, I think, for feminist radio to exist, is that it allowed for people to connect in a really special way that other media doesn't really give that opportunity. This is Bernice Zuniga. She began at Radio Cadena as a trainee and then became the news director. She actually already had some background in community radio production, originally from Berkeley, California, working with a Chicana and Chicano radio collective working out of KPFA, a radio station in Berkeley, California. So when she saw an advertisement for Radio Cadena to join the trainee program, she thought that this was a great opportunity to continue her work there in radio. And so she became part of Radio Cadena's radio trainee program and was the news director, which again, at the time, we have some statistics of public broadcasting employment. And what a 1974 statistic, which is around the time that, Cadena starting a few years later, we know that only 30% of all jobs in public broadcasting were held by women. And even then, the jobs that they held were in clerical or low-level secretarial positions. And now, this isn't disparaging. I'm not disparaging. I actually find that the secretaries and the clerical workers are really important to the archival process. They're the ones that kept the files, kept the records. And so I'm not saying that this was, that they shouldn't work in these places, but that the fact that they only worked in these places really signals the gendered practices of employment within public broadcasting. And so for Cadena then to have more than 30% of women on staff and across different areas of employment really was profound.
Celia Prieto was born in Mexico. She is a...
I'm going to play for you another part of that segment. This is Celia Prieto. She was another one of the radio trainees, and here we're going to listen to her talk about her experience being a part of Radio Cadena.
Wife and a mother to a young 5-year-old child. A farm worker for most of her young 23 years, Celia's experience with Radio Cadena began as a trainee in radio broadcasting. Now she is Radio Cadena's public affairs producer.
Being a public affairs producer is exciting. Some of the things I have to do is screen 3 to 4 newspapers a day for news relevant to the Chicano community, plus information and news releases that come into the station daily. I also cover local news stories which require research, interviews, attending meetings, and press conferences. Then I have to write my scripts for the 2 news programs I produce. Producing news takes a lot of time, plus raising a family, but my family is very understanding. My daughter sometimes is very proud of me. She tells all her friends that her mommy is a disc jockey. My family is very proud of me too because they can't believe that I'm working in a radio station. I thought that I better get into something else besides farm work, and I thought I would give my parents something to be proud of, to be in a radio station and be a mother and raise a family and work at the same time and do something that will help the community. I plan to take some classes for communications. The very first time I did the news live, it was my first time. I was very, very nervous. And after my news was over, I came out and Rosa and Estella were waiting for me at the door and they were applauding me. And that made me feel really good because I get a lot of support from them, and I think that's what keeps me going.
So I think this clip is such an important moment for us to listen to Celia Prieto. This was, again, one of the first audio pieces that I actually was able to listen to, again, thanks to Rosa and her diligent archiving skills. But for a long time, I was just really curious about, what it was like for these women at the moment to be able to have a supportive environment, to encourage one another to create this really important type of programming, and what it did to their own personal agency. And what that did for me is that it really resonated with my own experience. I found that even though at the time when I was a radio producer myself, I didn't have any awareness of Radio Cadena or the work of these Chicana radio broadcasters, I felt very much similarly as Celia, that I had stepped into an environment that was supportive, that we taught each other how to produce radio. We were all volunteers, but we really took this task seriously, and we showed each other how to produce, how to edit, how to record, how to write, for radio. And this was such a transformative experience for me, that when then I hear that it was the same, that 30 years earlier for these Chicanas, it really spoke to, and speaks to the power of radio production and media production, and what that does for accessing this feminist agency of being able to speak, to be able to have a voice. We have a voice, and to be able to showcase it, right? That the voice isn't given to us by somebody else, but that we're able to, in fact, record and produce and share that voice with others, so that then they are also inspired to, do the same for themselves. So this was a very transformative moment in my research, to, again, be able to have this artifact of these women talking about their experiences was really important. And to then hear it, right, again, to see the images are so impactful, again, as a producer, to see these Chicanas, splicing the tape. So here on the left, you see Celia cutting together, the magnetic tape to edit the radio show. And again, this was prior to the digital tools that make our life so much easier. You can undo a splice of a cut you did in your reel, very easily, for the most part, until your computer crashes and then you lost everything because you didn't back it up. But back then you really didn't have much of wiggle room to produce or to edit your things, in a artistic and creative and taking the work seriously, right? So one of the things that I think is important about these images as well is that you see the labor, you see the care that it takes to create these programs, right? To create one segment, this is for one day, for a few minutes, and again, the amount of work that they did just was so important, and spoke to a very particular community that, again, was not often included in production. And again, just seeing these pictures really show us the amount of work that they did to do that. The anti-sexist policies at the station included not airing any sexist music that was degrading to women or to the community. This is Estella Del Villar, and she was in charge of listening to the records that came into the station and flagging any songs that were deemed derogatory. She started with KDNA as a secretary while working at the station in Seattle. She actually was at her desk when she was needed on air. It was an emergency. The radio host that was supposed to come in didn't show up, and so she had to be on air. And this was actually something that I have found in other women, other examples of women on the radio have similar experiences. My new project with Graciela Olivares, who was one of the first women on the air in Phoenix, in Arizona, she also was on air because a DJ didn't show up. So people not showing up to work has benefited Chicana radio broadcasters in some ways, but they've really taken that opportunity and really heightened their experience at the radio station to include that of then being producer or like Estella, music director. And so to have that task of knowing that music plays such an important role in our culture, and that ideas and ideals are transmitted through music, that we need to practice anti-sexist, anti-misogynist, musical practices and not play those songs on air. Just something that, again, was very revolutionary for its time. And just to quickly wrap up, I wanted to showcase and show you all the online archive that I've been working on for the past several years now. Part of my work, part of the Chicana feminist praxis and methodological work of really disrupting these narratives is I've been inspired by the digital humanities and by the work of radio, community radio, to create things that are accessible and beneficial to our communities. And so along with, writing a book, I've also been working on, and this is still a work in progress of adding more and developing more, but this online archive, feministafrequencies.com, is the place where you can go to and see many of the images that are in the book. You can listen to some of the recordings that we've been able to digitize, my own recordings from being part of Cerebral Radio. And it is, again, a way to not just share the work, but also to disrupt the ways in which we oftentimes the academic scholarly imperative is to take our research and to put it in an archive that oftentimes is at a university or behind a lock and key, and that's great. I'm not knocking that work. It's very important work. I think my work should all this work should also be in an archive, but when it's not, and it's it's difficult, there's a lot of backlogs to archives, there's not enough staff or funding, right? There's so many issues, both technological, logistical, staffing, funding, but now that we have tools like relatively low cost websites and scanners and hosting capabilities, I have found that putting a lot of this work online is, again, a way of showcasing the work, but also making it accessible to the communities that that I'm speaking to and speaking with. So I just wanted to show a bit of the website of the archive, where, again, you can see not just the images in the book in full color, right? Is another benefit of having these online, but images that I couldn't put into the book as well. We have here a picture with Cesar Chavez, who visited Cadena in the 80s and was inspired to start their own Radio Campesina radio network. So again, the United Farm Worker Movement, seeing how Radio Cadena was reaching farm workers and organizing with farm workers through radio, started the Radio Campesina radio network that's still on air to this day. But just other images, other parts of the archive documents, station documents, the program guides. The Tres Hombres Sin Fronteras was a radionovela as well. I'm sorry, a photonovela. So it was in print as well as on the radio. And again, showcasing HIV/AIDS awareness for farm workers in particular through this medium. So these are things that you can see on the archive, along with the forthcoming podcast that is still in development, but that I hope to one day also share with you all, a podcast that will, be a companion piece to the book. And again, just give the oral dimension, the audio, right? The audio that we do have, having that accessible and as a teaching tool as well. So I will stop there, and I'm really excited for your questions. And again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation, Professor De La Torre. This was absolutely fantastic. And I know I have so many questions, but I want to remind our audience to please submit your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will address them shortly. And I would like to get us started with one question. I truly found the innovative production practices that you outline in Radio Cadena as a resource for the community through programming truly fascinating. And I'm really wondering, how do you envision or really find this programming problematizing traditional constructions of Latinidad within media constructions through the various forms of community and feminist-centered programming, especially as it worked as the space for the community for different voices to be heard, and really contributed to the creation of a shared sense of Latinx identity within this US-based context, right? So yeah, would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the fabulous question. One of the things that struck me early on about this research and the participation of women is how much it debunks the myth that Chicanas, Latinas were not involved in public broadcasting and media production, right? So oftentimes, especially when it comes to questions of representation, Chicanas and Latinas are talked about, as how they're represented. And especially within the visual realm, right? We know a lot about how Hollywood has represented Latinas, how they've stereotyped Latinas, how harmful and hurtful these stereotypes have been and continue to be. And so for the radio station to not just allow women to be on the radio, to have a voice, right? Especially when, for radio production and media production, a women's voice is often not considered one that is nice to listen to, or, there's a certain, tone that oftentimes gets characterized with public broadcasting, right? The scholar Christopher Chavez talks about this in his wonderful book on Latino NPR, and, that there's this idea that we have about the public broadcasting listener, right? So to have Radio Cadena and these other radio stations, producing programming in the 1970s, in the 1980s, through very little resources, through a very rascuache, or a do-it-yourself, do it with others, help each other, type of production aesthetic. It really shows us how we were involved and have been involved in production from, the beginning. And again, to have women's voices be showcased in such a central manner really speaks to the intersectionality of what types of radio programs were being produced at the time, right? The fact that the women, again, brought on board issues of domestic violence, of incest, but also, really recognized their place within the family. They had cooking demonstrations, they had, different resources for the family, health, breastfeeding and asthma, and like I said, the HIV/AIDS prevention program. So again, this really speaks to how when we have the tools to create media, we are really creating a media that is speaking to multiple forms of not just injustice, but also to our multiplicity as a Latinx community, right? That we listen to not just like rancheras, but also we're into jazz. And again, so being able to see that in the 70s, there was so much dynamic programming, really shows how diverse the community really is.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I know Facundo from our team has a question.
This was truly fantastic. I especially enjoy the work that you did on the archival. It's thinking about probably building upon Val's questions, and I'm were responding, how they're consuming this content, how they're participating, shaping the radio based on their interaction and what they really or truly needed at that time. And what you mentioned about, they were not just listening to rancheras, but also jazz and other type of like genre. And I'm curious how they define also their audience. Were they thinking about like something Latino or Latinx audience, or were they thinking about like Chicana or like Mexican based on the type of content they were trying to program? So I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully I caught most of your question. You cut off a little bit, but when it comes to, you were talking about the audiences, right? And how they identified their audience. And, you know, in the artifacts, in the program guides, they do use the term Chicana, Chicano. You know, they were very much part of the Chicano movement, part of that larger cultural, renaissance that we come to identify as the Chicano, the Chicano movement with, art and music, theater, right? Having that engagement with the community and those cultural practices really informed what kind of audiences I think KDNA envisioned. In the artifacts, we also have a very strong Tejana and Tejano, audience in mind. We have a lot of the communities that traveled to the Pacific Northwest have really strong and deep roots to the Rio Grande Valley in Texas and South Texas, and so oftentimes, the Tejano identity was really prominent within their programming, right? They would host different music groups. They had Lidia Mendoza at one point, local artists, right, from the community, musicians, have them, come on air. And so the listener really was one that was Spanish speaking, right? That was really important for Radio Cadena's producers, was to really speak to the Spanish speaking community. But as we saw in the program guide, they weren't, unaware of the fact that we also speak English, right? That there's a lot of Spanglish being spoken, that, a lot of the kids growing up with Cadena are also English speaking. And so I think they try to account for that in some of the programming, but I think for the most part, they were deeply rooted, not so much in a pan-Latino identity, although, again, they did air, music from different Latino artists, Violeta Parra, just sort of the music of the time, the protest music of the time coming from Latin America. But for the most part, they really were, deeply within the Mexican-American, Tejano, Chicana, Chicano, identity.
Thank you so much. And now I'll give the screen to Mora, who also has a question.
Thank you, Val, and thank you so much, Professor De La Torre. This was super inspiring and a fantastic presentation. I have a question that connects the radio broadcasting initiatives that you showed to us with contemporary forms of podcast production. I'm thinking about, for instance, the Locatora radio podcast that Professor Cepeda shared with us in a previous edition of the seminar. So I'm thinking, what continuities and discontinuities are you seeing in terms of production, circulation, reception of radio/podcast initiatives in this community? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. Thank you so much. I see the continuity that is, very strong. It's the ways in which Locatora, that other Chicana Latina podcasters have been able to take these technologies, these digital technologies, and really create their own self-produced podcast is exactly the type of Chicana radio praxis that I see and that I talk about in the book. So I see them as a continuation. I see them as part of this larger legacy. I think that the fact that they're still covering a lot of the similar topics, women's health, violence against women, issues that are still important to feminists, and to marginalized communities, but that is very central to feminist work and to feminist media production. You hear it, in their podcasts, and so I really think that there is something just really a strong pull that audio-based technologies give Latinas, Chicanas and Latinas, right? That's really unique and different from visual media production, film and television, and now web-based, like web series, or TikToks, or what have you, with the moment, the reels of the moment. These are different types of reels, right? But there's still a gravitation towards learning for ourselves the technologies, and then using them to create community, and then again, not having such a competitive edge, right? Early in, I remembered when Latinx podcasts were really starting to become popular, there was like a Latinx podcasting network. There was, moments of recognition amongst other podcasters that, were doing similar work across different parts of the US and you know, across the border and in different parts of Latin America and so on. So I really do see a continuation, and I do see a difference, right? I think that there's a lot more, thankfully we have progressed in a lot of, you know, the queer and sexuality, you know, discussions of sexuality on air. I think, you know, a program like Tres Hombres Sin Fronteras wouldn't be as controversial today, although, you know, if you see the fotonovela, you see there's a drawing of a penis and them putting the condom on, and, you know, they're pretty explicit in the radio drama about, you know, talking about sex and having sex with sex workers. And so I think that it'd be a lot more open, but I still can imagine it would be, some people wouldn't be so fond of that kind of programming. But I really do see that we've made some strides in being able to have, you know, conversations in that nature. But I think there's still so much work to do. And I think what's still, you know, disheartening is the lack of funding, the lack of recognition, the lack of seeing these Latinx podcasters as innovative and as pushing the envelope, right? We, you know, can recognize, you know, other podcasts, you know, and we can think of maybe why we all listen to certain podcasts, but I think that is still very much a barrier for many of the Latino, Latinx-based podcasts. That was similar to the low cost or to the lack of funding that Chicano stations had. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Monica, for a really inspiring seminar. Thank you, Valerie, for an excellent moderation as always. Thank you to our audience for staying with us through the end. And I invite everybody to join us for the next installment of this virtual seminar series. Once again, Monica, this was terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
You too. Bye now.